Well, hello. Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We are really glad to have you with us for this show. If this is your first time tuning in, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor of the Pacific Northwest. I pastor the Westminster Presbyterian Church, the most common name in all of Presbyterianism, closely followed by maybe Covenant. But anyway, I've written some books. My latest book is In the House of Tom Bombadil. I've been a real estate investor and a home improvement contractor and a professor of philosophy. Enough about me. How about you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine, and that's true whether this is your first time joining us or not. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, a ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, and my latest book will be coming out in March. From Canyon Press. At least that's what they tell me. It's called 32 Christians Who Changed Their World.
Well, you're going to be in Moscow next week, so you can really put the fire to their feet on this one if they don't come through.
Well, hopefully that will be unnecessary. But actually, thinking about the No Quarter November videos, putting the fire to their feet is kind of an interesting metaphor.
Yeah, that is. Yeah, you'll have to suggest that to them. Put that. That. I just had this image now of Doug at the stake, burned as a heretic by the people over at the Gospel Coalition or something. But anyway,
it could happen.
Right. I think that's the next. I do believe that is the image that they will use now that I have put it on the air. They're going to have to do it now. Anyway, so Tom, introduce yourself and the subject of the day because it's your show today.
Okay. I'm Tom Price. I teach theology, Christian thought, ethics, philosophy, and a few other things. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. And I have been making the speaking rounds lately, kind of putting out there some of the material that will be the book that I've long promised. And the feedback has been very good. It's allowed me to kind of cut some things that didn't need to be there and run and clarify some others. I've been excited. I just actually, speaking of Westminster, I just visited Westminster, Massachusetts. Well, up there, Little Lutheran Church, Our Savior, invited me up to kind of talk a little bit about this material, and a lovely group of pastors in a beautiful part of the country, even if it is in Massachusetts, right?
Can you actually have a Lutheran church in Westminster?
Yes, yeah, the oddity. And the great thing, homecoming for me, one of the retired pastors attending the talk studied under my great uncle when he taught in Fort Wayne at Concordia homiletics. So that was a nice little homecoming. 20 minutes from the church my mother grew up in.
Wow! Now they didn't name it. Well, I think you gave us the name, but wouldn't it have been fun if they had named it Westminster Lutheran Church?
Yeah. They went for the Our Savior angle.
Right.
Yeah.
Hey, before I forget, I do want to say early on in the show, speaking of Presbyterian things, or at least alluding to them, we have been invited by one of our benefactors to have a live show at the PCA General Assembly in Memphis. And for no other reason than barbecue, I think we're going to make it happen. So there'll be some stuff that we'll be putting out to get folks up to speed on where it'll be and all of that. But something to look forward to if you have nothing to do and you happen to be in Memphis, or if you're stuck at the General Assembly and you're in Memphis. You can come and hang out with us a little bit. Anyway, Tom, take it away.
Okay, well, today, the running title is sort of artificial culture and artificial society and technological culture. For those who are familiar with, of course, Eliel's work, the technological society and culture, I'll be drawing a little off of that. And you may know the term artificial society from Mathias Desmit's book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism. So these are not original titles to me, and I'll be riffing off a little bit of their work, but I'll also be riffing off of Oliver O'Donovan's recently republished book, Begotten and Not Made, which is actually a brilliant work. It should be in your library today. it was prescient and is completely relevant for helping us navigate our times. And so, yeah, the thing that drives this theme of interest to me is how do we navigate our time, as Christians and the church within the conditions of our current Western identity crisis. If we just start with human nature, the classic sort of Christian contemplative wisdom was prayerfully, what is man that you are mindful of him? And then there's this rich unfolding of what it means to be a creature made in the image of God, placed with the dignity as part of creation. Well, take God out of the mix, especially the classic Christian view of God, and all of a sudden the question becomes sort of, what is humanity? Right. And at this point, you kind of take anything significant of nature out of the mix, and now you have, is there humanity? Is there any way to differentiate the human from anything else other than just sort of in a sort of maybe certain kind of quantifiable way? So we're going to be kind of looking at some of this. Chris, you want to run with something?
Well, it just reminded me of the fact that the paradox of our time, or the irony of our time, is that when I was younger, back in the 80s, everybody was commiserating the triumph of secular humanism.
Yeah.
And of course, the paradox or the irony is that the secular humanists don't even want to use the word human anymore. So, so it's in a sense evidence that there was some residue of the Christian faith in the humanist traditions of the West that people initially with the Enlightenment celebrated kind of the man at the center of things, man as the measure of Protagoras' famous statement. Now that's not even the case anymore. As you've noted, it seems as though humanity is passé with transhumanism and all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. It has been. There has been what did Francis Schaeffer used to call it? This long line of despair. I think it was kind of a good way of putting it. It's just this kind of increasing move from the glorification of the humane to the absolute denigration and elimination. And Glenn, I can see something ready to jump, so I'll let you go with it too.
I've been sort of pondering this from a linguistics perspective. This is my undergrad degree was in linguistics. And the English language is, maybe a couple of other modern languages, but we are the first language to make a systematic effort, at least, at eliminating words referring to male and female, adult and child humans.
Yeah.
Okay, and now we've eliminated words like husband and wife, father and mother. And there was an article that just came out where an scientific ethics group in Britain is arguing that we should use what was the terminology? Sperm creators and egg donors, or something like that, instead of father and mother. I mean,
mine has the natural dwindled.
the absurdity of this is kind of beyond belief, and it's I think symbolic of a war not only against humanity but against reality.
Well, this is
in which humanity is the prime front.
Yeah, this is what I mean. I think at the head by artificial society is the artifactual, and we're going to get there. I hope to unpack it. So let's keep your point there, and let me kind of step into it, maybe a little back to kind of give people some context to kind of what Donovan's up to. And I think both of the points you just made, you're going to find fit right into those initial sets of, how did we get here? And okay, now that we understand that, and of course we've been at this for a while, so we understand that. But look at the kind of identity crises that are created, or the reality crises, and the relation to reality that are created. And think of this just before I jump into the kind of common churchgoer, the grandparent who all of a sudden their grandchild's coming home and saying, "Hey, look. I can, if I want to be a boy or a girl or whatever in between, I can do that. It's within my competence with the help of, a medical technique to do that. And there's nothing wrong with me doing that. And as a matter of fact, there's nothing that should limit me from doing that. And, what does that mean? Yeah, a grandparent can wisely say, look, you've been created good, even though we're in rebellion against it, you can receive that gift and not, chop it up, if you will. But they may not have much more resource of how to go about navigating. And even if they can't convince those that have already been convinced, how do you kind of shape and orient and navigate a church to keep to its own resources and vision at a time where it's been going, it's been thoroughly attacked. And I think one way into it, and for those, especially you two, who have heard me go through this story and the way I go through it, I'm going to give it the tiniest synopsis. For me, it's very helpful as a theologian to recognize that theology and spiritual intellectual aspects are significantly at the roots of all these things. There are others, all of the conditions of contingency and history and nature, but that they are not severed from the theological and the spiritual, therefore, thus the intellectual in some way. And I have went on and on and on to kind of explain why we've gotten into the kind of irresolvable tensions that end up with these kind of conflicts and contradictions, in views of, what, the pathologies of our time in relationship to what it is to be a human, and really the polarities within a kind of shared worldview, if you will, that arise and can't be resolved, and they create more tensions. And so I'll get to that. But one of the things that happened as I go on and on about is that there was a shift from a classical view of God's relation to the world, in which, God basically was not like the pagan deities who was on the same plane of being, but at the top. And so in the pagan world, as we know, basically God and the world needed each other, if only to be opposite so they could distinguish each other. But there was no such thing as a God that was the source of all things on God's own plane of reality, right? And so language like being and becoming, right? In the pagan world, these are they're antithetical, right? So when the incarnation of God in Christ comes along, the church says, wait a minute, the pagan systems are not going to work, because you cannot have antitheticals related in the human divine relation of Christ. So we have to rethink the way transcendence works and the way divine involvement in the world works, in a Christian way that doesn't lock God into one oppositional reality within the one reality that is, right? So they break hold and they use that language in a different way. This is what I think a lot of Christians who are against the philosophizing of the early church don't get. That language is not being used. They're using the same terms, but they are breaking those terms open to serve a radical different view of God and God's involvement in the world.
What's kind of fun is that a children's author, actually a young adult novelist, Rick Riordan, who wrote the Percy Jackson series, actually gets this.
Wow.
and what's fun about it is it's the Percy Jackson series, and Percy Jackson, is a character who is a demigod. He's the son of Poseidon or Neptune in the stories, and in the introduction to the very first book, Rick Riordan says, he actually is getting into the nature of these gods. Yeah. And basically, he's saying that they're just what you just said, just bigger versions of us. Yeah. And then he raises the question: is there a God? And he says, well, that's theology, and we can't get into that. Yeah. So he notices, or he notes in a young adult book, the thing that you're talking about, that many people don't understand they think about these things.
And so what the church did is, if it wasn't, what it recognized is, one, God is so transcendent because God's the source of everything, that by being its source, his relationship, the free source to everything, his relationship to it is free. He's not determined by it, even though it is determined by him all the way down. But that determination is not a negative, it's a plus, because it's the means by which we receive all the gift he desires to communicate to us. So there's a harmony between what it means to have our natures and unfold them in accordance with God that isn't conflictual because they're not opposed. And so God isn't God in opposition to us being material. God is the God that sources us to freely be the material within our own order of relation to him. Secondly, divine involvement in the world is not limited. The pagan vision, the divine was seen as like the most intelligible, the most permanent, and the most stable. And the only places in which divine involvement was in the world were those places where there was things that were most stable, most intelligible, but the whole world of becoming and the chaotic order was somehow not related to the creator, was out of the creator's control. As a matter of fact, the creator had to work with it because it existed alongside the creator. It actually preceded. It's not ex nihilo. There's a material world that's a substrate of everything the creator has to work with. And so we don't have the Christian vision. We have one in which, sort of the divine craftsman or the intelligent designers tweaking some things down here and putting a little intelligence here. And but everything else is chaotic, doesn't know its being and source to God. Not so with Christianity. All of creation, the chaotic and void, as well as the ordered and structured, owe themselves to the perfect God. Anyway, here's the point. What happens in the Christian vision is one of the things that is central to God is the fact that God is Lord. God is a sovereign will, but not only a sovereign will. All the names of God, intelligibility, perfect goodness, perfect, they all coalesce in the one reality, one triune reality that is God. They are different aspects of the same thing that it means to be God. Well, what begins to happen in the West is a little shift, and I consider it two steps. One step is it's a step backwards to the pagan vision. God is now brought back into the shared one of being, but there's a Christian deformative twist in it. Now this God is considered sheerly as will, not the intelligible stamp on everything, but fundamentally will. The intelligibility of God serves the radical freedom of God. But now this God is not a radical will giving a whole creation. It is actually a radical will within the shared creation and is basically considered a threat. Now, it takes a long time to get here, but when that threat happens and everything else is considered, basically, if it is, it's a will, there is a certain arbitrariness now to any imposed order because each individual thing is kind of stamping it with its own will and desire. And there's a conflict. Now God sort of has to get out of the picture if the human is going to enter into the picture. And you see this with some of the humanism that already started in debates with the Reformation and the like. Is divine will going to have priority, or is kind of the human will? And so you have a sort of a determinism on one side and then a kind of freedom on the other, but they can't both be harmonized easily in these pictures.
It's sort of like the zero-sum way of thinking that we sometimes see in economics. The more you have, the less I have. In this case, it's the more freedom God has, the less freedom I've got.
We have.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I've wondered about with this move is the degree to which it may have been influenced by Islam.
Yes.
Because in many ways, that is very much, that's very much the Muslim vision of God as being radically free and therefore radically arbitrary in his actions. Yeah. There is absolutely nothing that can constrain God in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Other than his own will.
Yeah. There was a book that I read a while back, and I'm trying to recall the title. Basically, it's like the title implies how Islam lost its mind, and it has to do with the rejection of Aristotle. And the kind of this early kind of nominalist kind of take that we are kind of getting at here.
Yeah.
I'll keep looking for it. I'm not finding it, but anyway.
But you're right. It was to Avicenna and what was Averroes?
Averroes. Yep.
These two figures, and Aristotle, comes back into fashion through the Arabic and Islamic, the Islamic philosophers. But then there becomes a debate within the Islamic world between this kind of will God's nature be determined by the rational aspects to which God would in some way be bound by rational reality. In other words, they're starting to pit attributes. And you're right, this is what spills over. And if I remember right, it actually creeps in through the Franciscans, which explains eventually why Scotus will embrace some of it, not all of it, some little.
Coming in through Spain.
Yeah.
It's coming in through Spain, and it is definitely. I suspect, I haven't really teased this out, but I suspect a lot of this has to do with the Franciscans' conflict with the papacy over property. I suspect ultimately that's where it connects.
And I actually believe Charles Taylor does, if I remember right, in his Secular Age, he actually does a little bit of looking at that very, very move. But yeah, I think you're right. And think of how radical this happens. Okay, so you have basically a concept of radical arbitrary will. And then this is actually it's a deformation of the Christian view of it, which is balanced with the full nature of God. This makes it almost a full nature. So any intelligibility is nothing more than the exercise of that unfettered freedom. But then it's brought down into a shared plane with everything else, so that it is radically. It's a paganized, deformed Augustinianism with Islamic influence. I mean, that's what we're dealing with. And now everything's under threat. There isn't a way to harmonize. I mean, so this is a long way in, but once that fails to resolve, you start to have figures develop that said, wait a minute, if the problem is because you basically have made in the realm of different beings, you've made God, determinism, or the human, basically radical autonomy, the central figures. What if we make nature the central figure? And of course, nature here is not considered just kind of static. It is filled with, if you will, it's almost analogous to some kind of will of its own, right? It's a will to survive, the will to struggle, the will to power, whatever you want. Emotion, it becomes, I think, the first kind of way of talking about it. And so what you have is two different conflicting strands that are actually kind of immanentized versions of the debate before. But this time in nature, you have Descartes, the Cartesian line, if you will, the idealist line, which says basically, yes, we are embodied creatures. We have a real body. But we do still have something. We still have a radical freedom, because that body isn't what's the most powerful thing about us. We have actually a higher substance, almost like the God of the Reformation, which makes up our higher nature. And so we have an infinite capacity to exercise our will and intelligence onto the world, that allows that natural body and its limits to basically come into conformity. So the more capacity we have through our instrumental reason to understand and control the world, the more freedom we actually will have. We'll be as gods, if you will. We'll be demiurges, forming things in our image and directing them to our path. So we know that's one chain. That's where Kantian man develops, and then it breaks off into it can break off into romantic idealism. It can break off into it has its own ends, radical freedom.
Yeah, what's interesting about this is, when you're dealing with early modern Europe through the Enlightenment, there are two different strands. You've got empiricism and you've got rationalism.
Yeah.
The rationalist strand in Descartes is what really drives the French Enlightenment.
Yes.
Which is then going to bring us to our favorite punching bag Rousseau, but also Voltaire, all of these other guys. And with that, on a political level, the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Because the idea is that we can use our reason to think through what will be the best approach to government, rights, all of those kinds of things. Which works great as long as you're the one holding the cord on the guillotine.
Yeah.
Well, this also gets us to kind of the observation that a number of important thinkers like Augusto Del Noce and Eric Voegelin have made, that our time is a time of Gnostic Revival, where it's not ancient Gnosticism for obvious reasons, but the family resemblance is impossible to deny.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, what you have here is a line that develops, and it has a lot of branches, as we're noting. A lot of people like Stanley Jocke, I don't know if you remember him and his famous book, Angels, Apes, and Men. This is the angelic line, right? Or the Gnostic. Or I just really think of it as this is us basically thinking, the voluntarist God becomes, in a sense, identical with our subjectivity, right? It's limited, of course, by our, you can see where Hegel's going to come out of this eventually, right? That God is becoming conscious through himself, in history. Right. And so you can really see where these threads come. But then the other side, as Glenn just mentioned, there was kind of rationalism pierces. Here's the other side of the horn. Just like we had radical freedom and determinism, as some will argue, Reformation versus Renaissance humanists. Now you have within the nature, you have a kind of radical autonomy, Descartes, in a sense, and then you have the Hobbesian line, which will become the kind of radical determinism. This is sheer materialism, and we're kind of a radical, autonomous, separated individual things that are always at conflict and always in motion. And really the best we can do, like you say, is some kind of control of the state, Leviathan, right? Or we can actually, because we're now evolved to a higher level of things, we can sort of transcend ourselves in some way and direct our own evolution, right? So you end up in the same place from these opposing views, but they don't resolve. And I'll give you an example how they don't resolve. The way in which we want to have a kind of organic, eco-modernist way of returning to the innocence of nature in our backing out of it, all the while we're okay with basically doing surgery on our own natural bodies. This is a kind of mess up I'm trying to kind of unpack. That's it. Mm-hmm.
This is where hippies from the 60s and their children are at odds. If you remember, the original Crunchies, they thought anything natural was better than something that was artificial. So you had Bert who went up to Maine and made Burt's Bees and all kinds of lip balm, and Tom's of Maine and with natural floss and all that kind of stuff. And now their kids are like pumping their bodies full of steroids and cutting things off, and it's just crazy.
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis said that in the classical world, or historically, the goal was to, I forgot exactly how he put it, but the goal was to align your soul with reality.
Yeah.
And in the modern world, it is to force reality to conform to your will.
Yes.
Conform, that's the word. Conform your soul to reality. Whereas now it's to force reality to conform to your will.
Yeah, and that is exactly what actually, and I think Donovan will actually pick up that very quote, but one of the things he does at the beginning of that book, he's trying to look at, that book is firstly dealing with kind of human fertilization and procreation from these new changes in ethics that he was starting to see. And one of the things why his book is great is sort of he begins with noting this radical shift now in medical research, science, and practice, where its relationship now to the human being has changed, where at once it was the last frontier that science would go. In other words, it was okay. And this was, I think, some credit to some of the people like Eliel and figures like that who recognized a long time ago how you are exploiting the environment in other natural kinds is going to come back to haunt you one day. And so O'Donovan's saying, well, it's come back to haunt us. So Christianity still, up until rather recently, and still does in some ways, has placed a limit there. But that the rooting of that has left, and this is what I mean: this movement to the artificial. And he talks about really one of the core distinctions he wants to make to still get a glimpse of what Christians probably held. I mean, Christians held versus today. He goes to the Nicene Creed, where he begins with the notion that the Son of God, he's talking about God here, Jesus, is begotten of the Father, not made, right? And so one of the things he wants to talk about here is something that's really lost now, is this difference between begotten and being made. And so to be begotten in the Creed is picking up actually an analogy from human experience, but it's basically saying that begotten means of the same ontology, the same being. So the Son is of the same being with the Father. The Son is not the result of the will of the Father. It's the result of the being of the Father. They share one being.
So like when we use the term begotten today with regard to our children, we're saying that they're our issue. They're the same nature as we are.
The same nature. And so what he's talking about, this comes from human experience, where human beings who have procreate have offspring that share the same ontology, different than the divine and the Son. But the way we do is we are sharing the same ontology. They're human being like we're human being. We didn't make them out of our self-determination and our will. In other words, we may have had a will to have children, but we don't get to make what they are, right? Their ontology.
At least yet. I mean, they're working on that.
That's where they're going. But we don't get to pick the ontology. Well, this is it. This is how he's distinguished it. Whereas making, now we are an interesting creature, because on the one hand, we are made by God. That means we're at God's disposal, both for what we are and that we are, and that God is the law of our being, right? His purposes and his wisdom are ingredient for what it means to be us. But enacting ourselves on our own plane and on our own being, we reproduce offspring of the same kind, right? And again, the distinction there is that. So, the difference between what we make is at our disposal. It's at our self-determination. We get to pick what it is in many ways. Of course, we have to work with raw material, but we're not procreating in a way that we are making the actual being of the human. We are kind of passing that on. We're participating in it with them. And so, like Adonai says, now as humans, we're unique. On the one hand, we're made by God. On the other, we do get to pass this on. But one of the things he notices is that very distinction now is starting to be blurred.
Tom, before we move to that, this discussion, I was just sort of tracking it down. I don't have a Bible in arm's reach, but I don't think people pay a lot of attention to this.
Yeah.
But in John 1:12, this has got implications, I think, for us directly. John 1:12, but to all who did receive him, who believed on his name, he gave the right to become children of God. That's where we usually stop.
Yeah.
But verse 13, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
You've got an interesting, corollary in some sense to what you were just saying about Christ being begotten.
Yes. Yeah, Christ being the only begotten Son of God, which means the only one whose substance is one with the Father. Ours is a divine sharing of that substance so that a creature can share it in a creaturely way. So we're not substantially one with God, but we do actually we share in the divine donation of that gift to us. It gets complicated on how to. I mean, that's why we talk about kind of metaphysics of participation, because it gives us one of the best sets of languages to balance it, even though it's not perfect. But
where I was going with it was that verse is very anti-voluntaristic.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And
this also gets us into some interesting territory, like when we think of theosis. So, theosis, sometimes people who aren't familiar with the teaching confuse it with what the Mormons are up to.
Yeah.
So the Mormons, they'll say something along the line of as God was, so are we. As God is, so will we be. That kind of thing, as though God is like in some kind of evolutionary kind of.
Yeah.
And he occupies space and time like we do. So the Mormon understanding of God is actually, again, a kind of falling back into the pagan ways of thinking. God lives on some other planet and has a lot of kids. Someday I'll live on another planet and have a lot of kids too.
That's right.
But the Orthodox understanding is what you just described, is we participate in God's being. So theosis is an entrance into God. We never lose ourselves like sometimes people talk about, you were like a drop in the ocean. And it's right. You're always going to be you, but you're going to be you in God.
Yeah, that's right. And what happens there is a lot of people, maybe this is a good way to clarify it, is the more God-like, the more you participate in the divine life, the more the distinct creature you are becomes. The more the difference happens, the closer you get. The more refraction of that divine life that you specifically are is manifest, the closer you become to God. You don't get absorbed up into something.
Doesn't Chesterton say something along this lines? Essentially that the wicked are all kind of boring, and because they're so much alike, but the saints are so marvelously variegated. They're so different from each other.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be important to come back to when we talk about the rich Christian vision that really contrasts the artificial and the artificial theosis, because I do think there is an attempt here to not only see ourselves in some ways as kind of, God or gods, whether it's the most advanced in terms of consciousness and evolution, or whether it's kind of my participating in my subjectivity in the infinite. In both cases, or my capacity to self-express, right, or auto-create is the new stuff. I think all of these are variations of a perverted sense and a paganized distortion of Christianity in its new mix that perverts the image of God and really messes things up. But one of the things Donovan gets to is he goes, what marks the technological culture he basically says, following Eliot, is not what it does, but how it thinks. And he's following George Grant here as well, the famous Canadian philosopher, if I remember right.
Not our friend from Tennessee.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. He goes, but this thinks basically that everything it does is a form of basically making and producing. So everything we do, procreating, whatever it is basically marked by, defined by, understood either as the product of our making or the raw material on which we can actually start making, putting our own will and imprint. So everything is basically at our disposal of our will, and it can be determined through scientific technique to master, control, and direct. And he talks about politics is now defined as making a better world. And it uses all the various techniques, mass media, and everything else to do it. Then human relationships now, building a successful marriage or relationship. There's this construct going on. He basically said this is where we kind of have ripped ourselves out of the organic doing. And he's not talking about the hippie sense, but the way in which we're connected. And some things, you just, it's like some things are just the unfolding naturally of your relation to the natural world, which produces certain kinds of spontaneity that are gifts, like real love and having fear of bad things and being able to worship.
Well, this quest for total control precludes, gratitude because of something that's been given to you. This also gets us to something that Del Noce gets into with regard to Marx and his shift from Homo sapien to Homo faber. The idea of man, the knower, to man, the maker, and his famous critique of the philosophers. The point is not to describe reality. The point is to change it.
Change it. Yeah.
So that sounds so appealing to young people. Like when they come across Marx and his statements along that line, it's intoxicating to them. But they don't realize the price that you pay when you buy into it.
And I'm going to throw a little hint out that's will be a little controversial, and it is because they've basically all internalized a feminine virtue ripped from the larger virtues called compassion. But I'll get there. This is something that Donovan brilliantly points out. But one of the things of technological culture is it's got its hands on everything. And as we said, we've already have the view of humanity there. Whether it's what other strand you take is ready to run with this. You can control your evolution by understanding the world and directing it into the directions you want, and the like. So one of the things he said that goes away right away, though, in such a society with this psychology, it fails to be able to see any aspect of human activity which is not a matter of its own making and construct. And therefore, it loses the ability to see the significance of natural things and kinds that aren't its business to intervene with. And secondly, it basically makes them blind to the capacity to see that there is anything other than the artificial. And so he says, basically, as a result, such a society is incapable of acknowledging the inappropriateness of technological intervention into certain types of reality and activity. Every situation's raw material and the very grounds of creaturely freedom is basically, they see being free as a creature as being able to play with whatever to make sure that any necessities that place a limit on us in terms of natural necessities should be able to be done away with to enhance our freedom and mastery of things.
So the only reason you're saying that, Thomas, is you're a white man. You're Eurocentric, and you're just on top, and you're trying to keep everybody down. I'm obviously speaking tongue in cheek, but this is actually what people believe because of these moves that you've described. The only agency that we can acknowledge is the agency of other human beings, not the agency of God. We can't even acknowledge the intelligence of the ordered world that we live in. It's all just stuff.
I actually think you have to take it a little bit further than that. You have to deny the agency of individuals. So that if you follow through on critical theory, all the problems in, let's say, the Black community are caused by whites,
by us,
because you see, they don't have agency. Right. The only thing they can do is respond to what we do. But it's not we as individuals; it's we as a mass.
But look what gets wed together there. This is where that's just what I'm talking about. The conflicts we have that arise from this modern picture. So basically, the white supremacy is basically identical with Cartesian man who has basically brought his will to bear by usurping power over everything else, willing to power and reach a state of basic power over everyone else with technology and just brutality, which has forced everyone else to basically remain oppressed under the natural determination of whites having it. But the problem, here's your problem. If you're going to have determinism all the way down, then so is the top of the chain. They're just enacting the particular way in which matter. They're just responding to natural forces like anyone else. If you're saying they're more advanced in terms of their evolution, I think you have a problem. You're the one claiming they're supreme, not themselves. I think what you have going on the flip side is if everyone is not, if everyone basically is made in the Cartesian image, the flip side, then no one is oppressed. They just may not happen to have been able to bring more things under their control, whether that's being a minority or something else. So this picture doesn't end well for anybody.
Yeah, Tom, but you're making a totally invalid assumption that consistency is actually a virtue.
Yeah, well, but it is interesting because
so Western of you.
Yeah, well, I was reading a book on this, and somebody actually brought it up, and they weren't even a Christian, but they were critiquing some of the moves in just critical theory in general. But it had a way of basically saying you are free if you have the basic the majority power. of identity determination. But how you got that must be illegitimate, because it must be something you wrongly took, where I don't know where this language of wrong and right and moral culpability comes from in a world that they basically argue is Darwinian. As a matter of fact, you'd be enacting what was true to Darwinianism if the picture they're painting was true. It doesn't. You're right. It doesn't pass the rational smell test, and therefore any attempt to make it do so is just me trying to force my will on it.
Right. So you get into these circular arguments, and you get into these question begging statements that you come out of the left.
And when you move it toward intersectionality, it gets even worse. because with intersectionality and I forgot what the term is off the top of my head, but the particular epistemology they use, that epistemology basically says that everything you think, everything that you believe, everything you think of as fact even is determined by your intersectional categories. So you are 100% determined.
But here is exactly the kind of the point of this. This is why this is an exemplification of where we live in an artificial society, because they're saying there is no natural that we have access to. There is no reality that we can bump up against.
Objectivity does not exist.
Everything is removed from us, so it is all construct of our making. So it couldn't possibly be that you have any truth. It couldn't possibly be that. As a matter of fact, my truth is recognizing that and then showing all the ways you're just trying to push your will to power, because that's all we are at the end of the day, wills to power, onto everyone else to make them basically serve your evolutionary advantage or your political or power advantage or identity advantage over someone else's. So this is what ends up happening once you can no longer, that first category goes that O'Donovan is onto, the begotten versus the made, right? Once that starts to go, then the difference between natural kinds and teleology and then reality, our relationship to realities, starts to become blurred with what is our making and construct, to where basically everything becomes artificial and construct, and then add that with the voluntarism behind it, and it becomes one will against another, or one group's power against another, or one imposition of their will on the world versus another. And who is a society to force its interpretation of what's good or bad or right or wrong onto anybody that may not fit that larger grid,
By the way, I came across that book I referred to earlier, relating to the origins of some of this trouble that we're dealing with in Islam. So the title of it's Robert Riley, who wrote a great book on the Crusades. I don't know if you guys remember that, but it's entitled "The Closing of the Muslim Mind." I don't know why I didn't think of that. That's such an obvious title to use. Yeah. But Robert R. Riley, "The Closing of the Muslim Mind: How Intellectual Suicide Created the Modern Islamist Crisis." And he goes into the very thing that you were talking about, Glenn, in that book. It's a great book.
The interesting thing is that in terms of tactics on the left, what we're seeing, standpoint epistemology was the word I was looking for. Yeah. That particular approach, which denies anything like objectivity, ultimately denies the existence of truth in any meaningful sense of the word. Yeah. They nonetheless have a very firm idea of what truth is in terms of ethics.
Right. Yeah.
And on one level, I can't entirely decide actually whether this is sort of a borrowed capital coming out of Christianity, the idea that oppression is wrong.
Yeah.
Or whether it's a kind of intellectual judo where you're using Christian values against Christianity.
It may include both of those, but I think if I can get to that issue on compassion, I have a feeling I know at least what motivates it. Mm-hmm. And it maybe O'Donovan will shed light on that or not, but I think if we hold that point, that what is behind this notion of fighting oppression, I think he at least gives us some insight. But before I get to that, let me just say he basically says, how did we get here? Well, he calls it the liberal revolution. Liberal is everything we just talked about, this radical freedom being basically unleashed without limit, and scientific technique now applied to it. And he said, how did it become a revolution? Why was there really no pushback when it started to move to doing this to humanity? For example, very little pushback in any strong sense when the abortion debate basically said a woman has a right to do whatever she wants, self-determine with her own body. Because his point was that is when medicine radically shifted from treating the sick to being able to be applied to otherwise healthy bodies for psychological freedom, or for freedom of the subjective will, if you will. So what he says here then is, well, if that becomes the case, well, then all of a sudden you start to see medicine start to be practiced on otherwise healthy bodies when the psychology or the freedom to self-determine or auto-create is at odds with it. And he said, you see this happening, of course, with this, what then he used the term transsexual movement with the operations. But he says, with every attempt to do this, there is a loss of actual freedom because our freedom is actually grounded in the reality. It is what he calls naturally, has a natural substrate. That is, this is what I always, when I talk about premised freedom, our freedom isn't radical autonomy. It's both determined by what we are and that we are by God, the law of our being, but also by our material substrate as well. We are creatures that are embedded and embodied. We have family, we have institutions, we have all these things, and this is exactly what they want to lift us out of, but they're the very things that give that freedom form. And so what he says is, look at what happens when you actually do the surgical operation to try to switch nature of gender or the sex of a person. They can't procreate. They can't either way. They lose the capacity. So they lose their actual embodied freedom. They actually aren't gaining. Now, they could argue later down the road, they may figure it out. But he's talking about what happens when you do that. But he goes, how did we get here? He said, basically, he said, I'll disagree actually with C.S. Lewis and a few of these other people who argue that it's sort of the mad elite scientist groups sinistering putting it on the world. He said, yeah, there's part of that. But it's also that a world has been made ready for it and wants it because it has embraced the technological culture and that view of or those pathologies and those distorted views of humanity. And so it doesn't push back because it agrees with it, because it sees it all as their commitment to fashion the future for themselves. And this is where the totalitarian element comes in.
Well, there's, when we think about how this kind of spread this in its most radical form, in the acceptance of these transgender surgeries and so forth, it takes me back to maybe earlier, less, I think, troublesome or dangerous, but nonetheless kind of gateway drug things that you could say helped to bring it about. So think about plastic surgery, for example. People who seek to maybe change the shape of their nose or whatever, or augment their bodies in other ways by getting a boob job or whatever, and we
or getting that, whatever.
Yeah, that's right. So there's that
facelift.
But then we can kind of dial it back even more and say, you've heard, I don't know if you've heard of body sculpting, this approach to body building, which is entirely kind of sort of obsessed with the perfect physique. And so there are a lot of other things that maybe don't cross a line. But
there's a lot of body dysmorphia long before gender dysmorphia. And I think you're exactly right. And that was one of the things I was trying, maybe to get here, is that blurring between, kind of ideal type and then technology being able somehow to do that, where, and again, you can kind of see where this is where deformations of theology can slip in, because on the one hand, we are aging and dying. That's part of the fall. And with the reverse of new life in Christ and the opposite movement towards life, you want to see your spiritual health kind of matched on the outside. So why not use technology to do it where we can, fix those problems that the fall and ignorance and sin and death brought? But what happens there is we go, first of all, we're trying to do something that isn't in our competence to do. Because that's the issue of the resurrection, and that isn't our job is to be heavenly minded, put off the old, put on the new. It's not about the preservation of what needs to happen as still the result of the original fall and its outcome. And secondly, what you have is there are parameters on which to do that. In other words, Donovan has this brilliant point where he talks about the way in which there's a Sabbath at the end of the creation week because God has completed those natures, even if they'll be perfected in terms of righteousness. They aren't a bunch of potential that we get to actually go out and perfect the way we want to. That's not part of our dominion. It's actually receive them as a gift. And so say, like we've talked about before, let's say the natural function of my ear is to hear, and I was born deaf in one ear. Well, using technology to help bring that about is bringing it back to a normative functionality. That's very different than putting a speaker system in my head where I can hear, I can hear underwater, in the ocean from here, right? In other words, it's not to say we can't use certain technologies for certain things, but augmenting ourselves in ways that radically, build the artificial into the natural. That's where a lot of this kind of blurring goes on. And so you can see where the trouble began. And this is what I said, we increasingly become so familiar and used to these interventions that we see some of them compared to the more radical versions as not so radical, when if you really think about it, injecting your face with that stuff and making yourself look like basically a blowfish in your 80s. I mean,
and the only person who's fooled is the person who did it. The girl walks into the room, or the lady or the elderly woman walks into the room, and we all know that not only is she vain, she's hideous.
Hideous, and they don't get the acting roles anymore when Hollywood does. I mean, other than the hideous, well, they're all hideous now, but they fit right in. But they even have standards.
Well, actually, if you want to find, we're picking on the women here primarily, although the men do the Botox stuff too.
Oh yeah,
but you want to see a more extreme example, in my mind, for guys. There are some people who are obsessed with sort of the bodybuilder image that do injections to artificially inflate their bodies. I think it's called synthol or something like that. And you look at these guys, and
you got guys.
They look like something out of a Marvel Hulk.
Not even a good one though. But you see some of these.
Not guys, even a good one.
Yeah,
the bad guys that do that.
They've got a 20-inch bicep and can't do a pull-up.
Yeah,
and their head is like this. It's real tiny, and the rest of
it. I felt like we needed to throw that one because an example, because it's not just the actresses trying to get parts.
Unless you want to. But you're right. Yeah, look at Mickey O'Rourke now. I mean,
I've not seen him.
He's as guilty as the actress. Oh, you don't want to see him. Hideous is from the Reconstruction. But John Kerry. I mean, anyway, I'll stop. But yeah, it is all part of this lifting. I think a loss. There isn't this aging gracefully. There isn't the natural beauty that's still resonant in even the fallen aging.
Well, this is interesting because I think we lose sight of some of the consolations that come with aging. Yeah. So I posted something about beards the other day, and that was kind of fun.
White beards.
It's obviously, Glenn, you know it. You're beginning to experience this, Tom. but there's an upside that's lost, I think, because of our fixation on youth. I really do get a lot of deferential treatment, and not because I'm frail, but just simply because there's something that communicates, I think, at a very visceral, fundamental level to other people. So like my granddaughters are fascinated with my face, the white beard and all that kind of stuff. And, but this attempt to make artificial youthfulness as foregone that. I mean, we just don't have a sense of the consolations that God has built into things.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder if that's why all of a sudden something about, the natural losing of hair or this becomes almost a threat. And then therefore you do become almost seen as that which you have to, a denial of certain aspects of like masculinity that come with aging, become a threat. But
to whom? So no one is threatened by my beard except me. Yeah, that's what I'm getting. I
would
get,
say
but I get a lot
of the women professors on the universities and some of the men too.
No, I'm completely straight about this. The most liberal people I know defer to me.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
No, because I think it's an involuntary thing. I don't think it's it's socially constructed at all. I think it's something that is built into the fabric of the world.
You should read some of the early church fathers on beards.
Yeah, I have. It's a lot of fun. But
they're pointing to that very thing, though. I mean, I use those as jokes for obvious reasons, but they're pointing to the exact phenomenon you're talking about, Chris.
Yeah. So to your point, though, Tom. Yes, the liberal feminist will make an argument against it, but when they encounter you. There's a deference that they can't help but give.
Yeah. Well, I think, and I think my point with it, with my comment was more like Donovan, they don't know what to make sense of something that isn't artificial. And so, maybe that explains on a the fact that we are still embodied creatures may mean a deference that is natural that they don't even wouldn't want to subscribe to.
So, like I was in Powell's, bookstore in downtown Portland the other day, a regular sort of hive of nutty, sort of lesbian and gay culture. A great bookstore, by the way. I don't think you should be scared away by the purple hair. But if you walk in. If you're a man and you're in good shape and you walk in, you've got gray hair and a beard and just stand up straight, everybody gets out of your way. They literally do. They'll look at you and then their eyes will drop.
Yeah.
It happened again and again. I wasn't trying to threaten anybody. I was just walking around looking at people in the eye. And they would all just kind of give way to me.
But this is a neat episode in the artificial confronting something of the natural, the purple hair versus. I mean, but you have to think it has to have in a world that is continuously trying to be removed from these things. It has to have effects. I mean, one is like you're saying, there may be a certain way of deference that they're not even aware of. They wouldn't want to admit. But on the other hand, there's got to be some kind of It isn't from their common sphere to see, and so. But let me get to two real.
We should wrap it up with those 2 points.
Yeah. So the thing is, Donovan basically said, how did we get to here in mass? Well, one was the moving away from the classical virtue of basically studiousness, well-formed appetites towards loving the good known and receiving the gift and not exploiting, but actually trying empathetically, like science is actually moving back to understand reality and therefore the gifts, and then being good stewards, using things, developing, creating, but not in a way that is kind of like Francis Bacon had argued, basically crush the reality to get to know it. But the opposite was the move towards curiosity, where that appetite was no longer governed. Those affections basically were trying to get knowledge through control, dominance, to impose their will in greater ways. And you can, again, see the totalitarian impulse. And O'Donovan says, when divine providence basically came in, was starting to weaken in the sense that we could leave the consequences to God because we can't have control and know everything, there became this obsession with knowing everything and controlling it. And this is where your totalitarian impulse is, and then the next thing he talks about is this shift in virtues classically, wisdom, what he calls here was a classical masculine virtue, was tied very strongly to understanding natures. In other words, you could, and so to have compassion, which was emphasized more strongly as a feminine virtue, those things were balanced, like the volitional and the intellectual, if you will, just like in God, in the classic Christian view, exercised in humans the right way. Well, they get kind of ripped apart, just like voluntarism, the will does against wisdom of God. Well, now basically compassion gets read almost voluntaristically, or as basically as the highest motivation. And he puts it this way. He goes, along with this shift, basically, let me see where I have it. Basically, compassion, a classical feminine virtue, now runs towards helping the suffering, which prompts it to immediate action with a resolution that doesn't require wisdom, because the will to care is enough. And this is what I mean by that notion in CRT and all of the rest of fighting oppression. If it's grounded in this kind of volitional compassion, it sees suffering. And so without wisdom of recognizing that there is a created order, there is a nature we're related to, their attempt to resolve that. So they just adopt it, like you say, culturally, that oppression is wrong and they see suffering. And so for them, it's basically to move in what he would call almost an irrational compassion. I think he calls it sentimental humanism in other places. And basically, this becomes the dominant motivation at all costs. Now, I'm going to read this thing and we can end with this. But he basically talks about two different ways of depicting these two virtues. One is from Mozart's The Magic Flute, and the other one is from Beethoven's work, Fidelio. And he says, basically in The Magic Flute, the difference between the two is the difference between two different worlds. The journey from darkness to light, which is charted in Mozart's masterpiece, is presided over by the priest king Sarasatro, who represents wisdom. In Beethoven's program for the enlightened, there is no place for the enlightened king, right? Nor could there be. The story tells of a devoted wife, Leonora, who, in order to rescue her husband, Florestan, who had been imprisoned in the dungeons of a tyrant, Pizarro disguises herself as a young man. She cloaks herself in masculine virtues, but with compassion, right? Fidelio, and becomes the assistant to the jailer. At the point of crisis, when Pizarro is about to slay Florestan, she withstands him in, as it were, by a preordained fate at the very moment when they're going to release the prisoners and overthrow the tyrant's power. The message of the plot is simple. The revolution, which will bring brotherhood in place of oppression, is accomplished not by traditionally masculine virtue of wisdom applied to nature, but the traditionally feminine virtue of compassion. But that compassion needs to be cloaked in a higher masculine virtue in order for it to carry out its cause. And he says, superior technique of the sciences becomes that forcing vehicle to force that compassionate vehicle on the reality in the name of care, which basically has us put all of our arms down and say, okay, we have to run with it. And just think of it. What is the whole notion of affirming care? Affirming care is supposedly cloaked in this virtue of compassion, but it uses scientific technique to do the alterations, power, traditionally masculine emphasis, but it also uses the force of the state to make sure everyone complies with that compassion, right?
Yeah. What's the book again that you're reading from?
This comes out of Oliver Donovan's Begotten, Not Made.
Yeah. I think that's a great point to end. We've gone a little long. We should maybe have a reference to the book in the show notes. So that people can, because that's very rich stuff. Yeah. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast and making it all the way to the end. We're glad for your support. Just so you know, we are now a part of a new podcasting network that's sponsored by Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama, and we're glad to be connected to those guys. They're a great bunch down there. We're still on the Fight, Laugh, Feast network, and of course, we're still, you can still find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all those places. But we wanted to make note about this new connection and encourage you to check the shows that they sponsor out. Also, if you're interested in supporting our work, you can do that through Patreon. We have a Patreon account, And we've got a number of people there who give to us on a monthly basis, and we try to do events for them to give them a little extra insight into how we do things and give them opportunities to ask us questions and so forth. So we commend that to you if you want to support us. Anyway, we should make that, I think, the final note. So next time we'll be back, and hopefully you will too. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might also enjoy the new book by Jason Cherry, The Making of Evangelical Spirituality, now available on Amazon.